Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show. I am Dr. Duke, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by professor and author of a new book entitled Brutal Minds, The Dark World of Left-Wing Brainwashing in Our Universities. Dr. Stanley Ridgley.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. It's a great honor to be here.
This book is a revelation. I mean, I'm writing my own book, and I know how hard it is. There's so much information about what's happening with the left on college campuses. I find myself finding it very difficult to get a rope around the subject. It's so powerful and big. What you've done here is very concise. It's very readable. Obviously, you are a very educated man, but you've written a book, I think, that is accessible to anybody. So before we do anything else, give us more of your backdrop. For people who don't know you, you have an extensive career. Tell us about where you've been and what you've done.
Well, I'll keep it brief. I do appreciate the accolades. I'm a former military intelligence officer, and I served in the Cold War in Germany for 2 tours. I have a PhD in strategic studies, focusing on the Soviet Union, and I also have an MBA, an international MBA, that led me to study in Paris and in Moscow. And I've been working in higher education now for about 15 years, starting at Temple University and over here now at Drexel University. In fact, I'm broadcasting right here from my office in West Philadelphia. That's where the magic happens. And again, I'm delighted to be here and talking about what I think is one of the crucial subjects of our time. This is an amazing story, and it's one that I was led to through my research over the past 6, going on now 7 years. In other words, it's not something that I contrived to write with some preconceived notions. It is something that I wrote as a result of my research over time.
Well, let's talk about Brutal Minds, your book, and the idea. The idea behind this is really, on one level, it's really simple. On another level, it's very deep. That ultimately where we're heading is brutality. That what we're seeing from our universities, certainly over the last 25 years, and you go all the way back to the 1960s, I'm sure, and before, is that what we're leading to is less critical thinking, less genuine discussion, less freedom of thought, and always down through history, the more of that you wander into, the more brutality that follows. Talk about the theme of your book.
Well, the theme of the book is of course, brutal minds, and the idea that a group of anti-intellectualists are slowly taking over the university and imposing an orthodoxy on the university, and they're doing this through all sorts of levers of power that I'll get into as our conversation progresses. But that's essentially it. That there's this orthodoxy that is very medievalist in a sense, in the sense that if you don't believe and mouth the mantras of the orthodoxy, then you are identified as a heretic, and you will be treated accordingly. The university has its own version of cancellation, which is the popular vernacular of depriving people of platforms to voice their opinions and that sort of thing. The university has its own version, its own, I would say, very unforgiving type of enforcement of this.
Yeah, I've been the fake Title IX claims, the not hiring anybody who has anything that looks like a non-progressive thing on their resume, not giving people promotion and tenure. I've been at 7 different universities. I've been through it all. I've seen it happen to other people. Let me ask you. You brought up an interesting point. Who would you say? People always ask me, because this is a broad topic, who's doing this, Dr. Pesta? Where is this coming from? Is there any particular groups in particular that you single out as being more responsible or mostly responsible for what we're seeing here?
Yeah, well, let me first articulate what I think is the general view in higher education of the campuses, that it's somehow the faculty that are doing this. And my experience is that the majority of faculty are good people. They're just sticking to their knitting. They're doing their research. They're doing their teaching. They don't have time for this type of ideological indoctrination that I accuse the universities of engaging in. And some do. Of course, we have our gadfly faculty, and I know you're familiar with them, folks who seek a public audience on Twitter and that sort of thing. But it's really not the faculty. The faculty, in fact, have been protecting this group of folks who are also on the university, who are indeed engaged in this type of indoctrination, or as I call it, or properly, brainwashing. Who are these people? Well, they begin in the education schools, the schools of education. 2 decades ago, schools of education developed a program of advanced degrees whereby they would train people in crypto-Maoist ideology, grounded in Paulo Freire, and they would graduate these people in programs called educational leadership, higher education administration, student affairs, and they would then pipe these graduates into jobs on the university campuses that were created just for them. What I've just described to you is the first corner of a triangle in the beef and bones of the university. Moving up to the second entity is student affairs. These graduates of the education schools who are marching in lockstep, goose-stepping along the Strasse, believe in critical consciousness, the whole litany of capitalist patriarchy, etc., and they believe themselves to be college educators. That's the term for themselves, college educators, on par with the faculty. And they indeed have set up a para-curriculum, a co-curriculum, they call it, that runs parallel to the actual curriculum, which is, history, physics, poli-sci, sociology, that sort of thing. Over here we have the co-curriculum with fake instructors, fake curriculum, even fake transcripts, and that is where most of this indoctrination or brainwashing takes place. If I may, I'll stop right there, Duke, and let you react to that.
I think what you said is powerful. And just last year, I was reading an article about how the University of Michigan has 91 different diversity officers. Ohio State is 80-something. University of Wisconsin has more than 60, and most of them are making more than $100,000 a year. So when you take these educrats and you put them in these places in student government, they immediately start replicating themselves. And so what you get, and one of the things that really stood out about what you said, is they think they're at least the equal of the faculty or superior. They don't have degrees in anything that's really can be considered an academic discipline. This is just, I make this point about education. You hinted at this. Education, when your daughter wants to become a high school teacher, it's not the education department that teaches her how to teach English or science or math. They farm those kids out to those disciplines. Education programs are exclusively ideology because there's no core content there. So no wonder it's so easily overwritten by Marxist theory, because there's got to be something. They've got no subject matter to deal with.
Right, I agree with you 100%. I mean, we tend to think of student affairs people as the folks who, just make sure the pizza's hot and the sound system works and the ultimate Frisbee game kicks off, on time. They conceive of themselves completely different, and I agree with you on their self-arrogation of this importance that they are college educators. And where are they getting this ideology, and how is it reinforced? Well, the third entity that I talk about in Brutal Minds is you move down here off campus to the off-campus clubs. Now, these are professional organizations. There are 2 of them, and I'm not going to break out their acronyms. I'm going to hold it up right here for you. One is the ACPA and the other is NASPA. They're very important in the sense that they act as crucibles for the crypto-Maoist ideology. They run institutes that tell people how to run these types of indoctrination programs on the campus. They offer cargo cult, fake scientific, social scientific journals, and but most important is this: they set the standards for these graduate programs that are run in the education schools. Think about that for a moment. The student affairs professional clubs or organizations set the standards for the education schools graduate programs. People go to these graduate programs, they graduate, they move into student affairs position on the college campuses, where they begin to, quote, transform higher education. That's the motto of one of these professional clubs, boldly transforming higher education. Well, as far as I know, Duke, no one asked them to transform anything in higher education. As I said, keep the pizza hot and the sound system running. So that's the triangle that I describe in Brutal Minds.
Well, you mentioned one of the most famous examples of this is the Confucius Institutes, right? You have the Maoist government of China, to your point, pumping all kinds of money into American public universities, getting these institutes. These institutes then are using that capital to transform the way communist China is viewed in Western universities, making it heroic and the future, apologizing for the evils of Chinese communism, pushing American down that road as well. That's probably, I would think, the most famous example of this over the last few years. Lots of exposés have been done about this, how all this money that universities were taking, it comes at a great cost in rewriting history.
Well, and it looks and feels very familiar. Whenever you hear these reports, it kind of resonates with you. Say, yeah, you know what? That's true. You mentioned earlier the diversicrats at Michigan, and totaling in the numbers of 80s. It's up to 142 now, with a total budget, I believe, of more than $18 million. Studies have been shown that that's enough money to fund 750 full rides for 4 years for minority students, which is really what they're trying to do with these diversicrats. But the parallel that we find with DEI and this hierarchy that's been formed of bureaucrats who are really skilled in nothing. I think that their tenure in the building counts as a skill for these folks. They have a parallel hierarchy here, very much like the old Soviet NKVD had the political commissars embedded with units. Now, every school or every college has a diversicrat who is engaged in DEI. Well, who do these people report to? Do they report to the department head? Do they report to the college, the dean, or do they report up the line in this DEI hierarchy? That's kind of unclear, and it gives people pause. It creates a chilling effect, which was the whole idea of the old political commissar system back in the Soviet day.
What's really interesting is that not only are they're multiplying themselves like malignant cells multiplying, but universities all across the country are shrinking the faculty. You go back to what you said at the beginning. I think you're largely right. I mean, to be very blunt, most of my faculty colleagues are on the left, either moderately or extremely. But that doesn't mean that all of them, even some of the very progressive ones, seek to destroy free speech. However, what we see happening is that as the bureaucracy grows, the administration grows, all these diversity and all kinds of other experts grow, we keep shrinking the faculty. And so if you simply eliminated this needless level of bureaucracy, which is purely political, you got rid of that, not only could you bring in more kids, you could bring in more and better teachers as well.
I think so. I agree with you 100% on that. Luke, if I could shift to a second, one of the things that I find is very important is that why is all of the indoctrination exactly the same on so many college campuses, virtually literally every college campus in America? And that is because of the lockstep ideology that you've identified, you've alluded to. It's crypto-Maoist. It's based in Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is not a name that floats off the lips of the average person, but there's no one closer to being a patron saint of education schools. He was a crypto-Maoist. He was not really an original thinker. He was basically borrowed all of his education theory from Mao Zedong's education theory back in the 60s and 70s at the height of the Cultural Revolution. We all know what the Cultural Revolution was, in the sense of imposing thought reform on faculty and imposing thought reform on students. And so this is the viscera of what education schools are teaching now. And they're teaching it both to the teachers who are going down and teaching K through 12, and they're teaching it to certainly the graduates of these advanced programs in educational leadership and student affairs and higher education administration. I'd be happy to relate to you what exactly one of these brainwashing programs looks like.
Absolutely, please do so.
Well, most of these brainwashing programs, they're not advertised as brainwashing 101. It's not like it's like the Soviet emigre Joseph Brodsky said in one of his commencement addresses to Williams College. He said, the evil's not going to announce itself, stepping over the threshold and say, "I'm evil, I'm here to subvert you." That's not how evil operates. No, the fact is that these folks will engage in brainwashing. They'll do it surreptitiously, and they even have manuals. Believe it or not, I actually have a brainwashing manual. Let me preface this before I show it to you that by telling you where it came from, the idea of brainwashing. It comes from the social psychologist Kurt Lewin, who back in the 1940s became known as the father of the encounter group. He came up with an idea that you could manipulate a person psychologically with a three-stage process: unfreezing, changing a belief system, and then refreezing that belief system so that the target, the student, did not backslide. Well, the communist Chinese did the very same thing throughout the 1950s on into the 1970s. They're still doing it now. And American cults do the very same thing. And it always starts out by putting the student at ease. Now, here is a brainwashing manual right here. I'll hold it up for you. It's called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, a source book. Now, several of the articles in here detail how this three-stage transformation is supposed to occur. The idea and the goal of brainwashing is to utilize psychological manipulation, behavior modification techniques in a program, intentional program of destabilizing a person's sense of self, attacking a person's sense of self and identity, and then attacking the belief system that's extant, removing it, and then putting in or installing their own belief system, a ready-made crypto-Maoist belief system, usually based on social justice. And then the final element of that is to engage the student in lots of confirming activity to make sure that the new belief system doesn't erode. They call this doing the work. You've heard this phrase before, doing the work. Well, that's the three-stage brainwash system. But I'm going to make sure I quote this correctly so that there's no mistake here. Let me give you a quote from the brainwashing manual of how they view dealing with students. Quote, this is to start with: use low-risk self-disclosure and interaction in the early stages to establish a norm of self-disclosure. In other words, private information. If the environment is perceived as supportive, a person's defenses may be permeable. This is a quote. This is called the defending stage, the very first stage. And during this phase, students undergo, quote, challenges to their belief system in an environment that is supportive and trustworthy. Once the student is softened up with this, it moves into the second phase, which is surrendering. This is what they call it, surrendering. Students are presented social justice theory, crypto-Maoist ideology, and the process, quote, is confusing, disorienting, frightening. Students might feel out of control without known boundaries or familiar ground. They may experience strong emotion, such as anger and a sense of betrayal by those who were supposed to tell them the truth about the social world. Betrayal. Now they're talking about parents, they're talking about your audience. And this is why so many students come home and that first November Thanksgiving dinner, and there seems like a lot of anger, pent-up anger. This is because they're hearing this type of ideology and they're being programmed to behave this way. And finally, and this is an important quote from the book, a new set of beliefs becomes home base for interpreting experience and creating meaning. The past is reinterpreted and reconstructed into a new frame of reference. I mean, that's the brainwash right there.
It's amazing. And that second phase where they get angry and enraged, now that's white guilt, that's white rage. So They've got it pinpointed. The minute you get angry about your whole world of belief being countered, see, that's more proof that you need to listen to us. You wouldn't be angry if you surrendered all of that and come with a new paradigm.
Exactly right. I think that we have to understand that this brainwash program is not just for a particular one race of persons or one class of persons. It's for everyone. And the basic paradigm that they're offering in this is that, and let me make sure I get this right. This is from Bell Hooks, who's one of the most famous of the brainwashers with critical race theory, etc. These programs identify students, as you note, as either dominant racial beneficiaries of privilege or as oppressed victims. It's one or the other. And what is the victims of what? Here's a quote from a famous brainwasher, the late Bell Hooks, fine novelist, but that's about it. and imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal politics that constitute the dominator culture as exemplified by dominator thinking. That's her quote. And it's a primitive Manichaean villains and victims, oppressor and oppressed worldview, and it's the only perspective that students receive in these workshops or these brainwash sessions.
I mean, it really is. You are basically deprogramming a cult. What you're talking about is the way to step backwards. So you have expand upon that.
Well, I have a number of. Well, my book is about the fact that that there is indeed a campaign, widespread campaign of brainwashing ongoing and on all of our campuses by virtue of the student affairs bureaucracy and other bureaucrats who have made their way onto the campus through the side door of chain migration hiring. Well, I've identified who these people are, what the harm is that they're doing, what the ideology is. Now, what can we do about it? And that's what I want to speak today about parents, to parents that want to, the book Brutal Minds, this is my book, Brutal Minds, and in the last section, I talk about what we can do as parents, as alumni, as students, as donors to reverse this process. Now, you know as well as I do that reforming higher education from the top down is going to take a lot of years. We see a lot of good signs right now down in Florida and Texas and Iowa, but that's going to take a while. Parents with kids going into college now want information that they can use. What are the signs of a brainwash? That's the first thing I would say, other than just buy the book and read it. What I would say right now that's usable is the fact that if you are invited or required to go to a workshop, and usually they're oddly named, you're invited to go into a difficult dialogue or a courageous conversation or a racial caucus or a brave space or a safe space. That's how they're kind of weirdly named. And they're going to be invited to, quote, make yourself vulnerable. And you'll find this facilitator or this faculty member who is modeling vulnerability. And they're saying, we want you to disclose your feelings. We want you to basically fess up to an awful lot of stuff that they have no business knowing, personal information. They will utilize games, and one of the primary games that they utilize is called the privilege walk, in which you're lined up and you're asked a series of questions, which is really a survey, and according to the answer you give, you either walk forward or you walk back. And at the end, you are marked as someone either with lots of privilege, which is marked you for the rest of your time in college because you revealed all this private information, or you identified as someone who has internalized oppression, probably. And that's an example of a revelation game or an interrogation game where that kind of information is teased out of the student. Anytime you see these kinds of markers, and by the way, that is probably illegal. Without the informed consent of students. So anytime you see these markers, that you can identify as a brainwash program, it's a sign that you probably ought to back off or to engage in some of the activities that I list as possible courses of action in Brutal Minds.
Stanley, this is going to be part one, I guarantee you, because we're just getting into this wonderful book. So while we wind down this first part, close with this. What would you, as a mom and dad, tell your sons and daughters when they were going off? If you had to give them one piece of advice or one or two pieces of advice to avoid the trap, what would you tell them?
I tell them to go in and don't be scared. Don't be frightened, because they count on freshmen being frightened. It's a new world. It's a brand new situation. Don't accede to their authority automatically, okay? And with the tools and techniques I've given and provided in Brutal Minds, you should be sufficiently armed to take care of it.
Stanley Ridgley, this is the book, Mom and Dad. This is Brutal Minds. You got to get this. Read it with your kids before they go to college. If they're in college now, have them, pay them, do what you got to do to sit down and read this book with you. Stanley, we're going to have you back, but real quick, how can people get a copy of this, or how could they contact you?
Oh, you can get a copy of it on Amazon. It's there wherever fine books are sold, Barnes and Noble, and you can also go to my website, brutalminds.com, which will simply route you to the proper place to purchase the book.
Dr. Ridgley, it was a great pleasure speaking with you today. For all of us at the Dr. Duke Show, thanks for watching the Dr. Duke Show, and we'll see you next time.